I got home from the Ouachita on a Saturday afternoon in late October, drove straight through from the campsite to Fort Smith, 5 nights of hunting compressed into a single long pull back to civilization. I had the SD cards from all 3 cameras tucked in the breast pocket of my hunting vest. I always pull them before I break camp. Old habit from the years when the cards were expensive enough that leaving one behind felt like leaving money on a tree. I didn't look at the footage for 4 days. The hunt had been slow, warm weather through most of the week. The deer pushing late and holding in the timber through midday heat that had no business being in mid-October. I'd had 2 bucks in range across the 5 nights and passed on both. I cleaned the gear, restocked the perishables I'd eaten, called my son Kevin in Nashville to let him know I was back. Routine. Wednesday evening, I sat down at the kitchen table with a glass of iced tea and my laptop. This is the ritual I look forward to almost as much as the hunt itself. Going through the images, mapping the deer patterns, building the picture of what moves through a drainage when nobody's watching. An hour of sorting, coffee, the occasional frame you have to stop on twice. I made it through 2 of the 3 cards without anything unusual. Normal deer footage, a black bear. The raccoon that's been working my campsite for at least 2 seasons, based on a notched ear I keep recognizing. A sounder of feral hogs through the south edge of camp on Monday night. Then I loaded the camp camera card. I found the image from the 5th night and I sat at that kitchen table until past midnight, until the iced tea was room temperature and every other light in the house was off, and the only thing lit was the desk lamp and my laptop screen. I was looking at a shape standing 8 feet from the back wall of my tent at 2:58 in the morning of a night I'd been sleeping inside it. My name is Tom Lewis. I'm 61. I spent 40 years as a licensed electrician out of Fort Smith, Arkansas, and I retired 3 years ago when my knees made the decision for me. I'm not a man who lets unexplained things stay unexplained if I can help it. 40 years of electrical work builds a habit of tracing faults to their source. A circuit either works or it doesn't, and when it doesn't, you find the reason and you fix it. That's what I brought to those images. It didn't work here. I've been hunting the Ouachita National Forest since I was 23, 38 seasons. The Ouachita covers about 1.5 million acres across western Arkansas and eastern Oklahoma, and the Polk County portion where I hunt sits deep enough into it that the cell coverage depends on which ridge you're standing on, and the drive-in takes you past communities you'd miss if you looked down at the radio dial for a moment. Ink, Odin, Acorn. Names that feel like the map ran out of effort. You take I-49 south from Fort Smith through the pine timber to Waldron, and then swing west on Highway 270, which runs along the south face of the Ouachita Range, and the mountains around you run east to west instead of north to south. That east-west orientation is geologically distinctive, tied to how the folding happened 300 million years ago when the rock was being pressed up from sea floor. The ridges here are old in a way that the Appalachians are old. Older than most of what you'd stand on east of the Rockies. I turn off Highway 270 west of Ink and take the Forest Service Road 3 miles back into the timber, gravel that turns to washboard in dry weather and ruts in wet, and it ends at a turnaround where I park and hike the 1/4 mile uphill to the clearing. I found that campsite in 2001 with my hunting partner Mark Davis. We've used it every season since, or close to it. Natural bench above the Caney Creek drainage in the Caney Creek wilderness. Level ground on a north-facing slope, with a short-leaf pine at the west edge big enough to navigate by from 2 ridges over. There's a fire ring near the center of the clearing, flat sandstone pieces stacked in a circle, and it was there when Mark and I first found the bench. We didn't build it. I've never found a record of who did. We set the tent in the same spot every year. Door facing east, toward the creek drainage, because the morning deer traffic comes from that direction and you can watch it through the screen without getting out of the sleeping bag. The rear wall faces north, toward the pine timber running up the ridge. This past October was the first time I've done the trip alone. Mark had his left knee replaced in May. He'd held off 3 years hoping to get 1 more season in first, which is a thing hunters do, and the surgeon cleared him for flat walking but not hill terrain until spring. He called me in September and said, go ahead without him. I drove down alone. Haven't done that in over a decade. A solo hunt runs on different rhythms. More time in your own head. The evenings at the fire without the back and forth that makes 4 hours of sitting feel like one. I don't mind it. I've lived alone since Lorraine passed 4 years ago, and I've gotten used to my own company. But the camp that's been a shared space for 22 years is a noticeably different space with just the one sleeping bag. I drove in on a Saturday morning, October 8th of 2022, arrived at the turnaround around noon, hiked in 2 loads, got the wall tent up before dark. The tent is a Cabela's Alaskan Guide model, 12 by 14 feet, canvas on an aluminum frame, the kind you can stand up and cook in and ride out a week of rain without losing your mind. I've had it 11 years, and the canvas is still sound. October in the Ouachita Hollows has a smell at evening that I've never found anywhere else. The shortleaf pine resin cools as the temperature drops and closes down, and the hardwoods in the hollows release moisture as they cool. Red oak, white oak, sweet gum, the smaller understory stuff. And when you add wood smoke from the fire ring, it builds into something that only exists in this specific drainage, at this specific latitude, in this specific month. And you can't describe it to anyone who hasn't been there. The creek runs in the hollow 200 yards down through the timber. In October, it's low enough that you can hear individual rocks, the water moves around, a textured sound that fills the hollow differently than the spring flood roar. The barred owls start at dusk and call until midnight without much break. That who cooks for you cadence that people keep misidentifying as whip poor Will. Chuck Will's widows on the upper ridge. The rolling 3-note call that belongs specifically to the warmer nights of early fall. Coyotes down the creek around 11 some nights, a pack working something in the brush that got loud for a few minutes, and then went quiet the way coyotes do when they've finished. I slept without disturbance all 5 nights. I didn't hear anything unusual at camp. That detail matters significantly later. The days themselves were what they always are. Up before 4, coffee on the camp stove while the tent fabric ticked in the cold. The specific darkness before first light in the Ouachita Hollows, where the canopy closes out the stars and everything is a wall of black timber. Dressed and out of camp by 4:30. Moving the trail by headlamp, the beam cutting through ground fog in the low spots near the creek. The stand I've been using on the East Ridge for 12 years, a climbing stand I lock onto a red oak at about 18 feet and sit in until the light comes up and the deer start moving. October mornings in the Ouachita have a stillness that isn't quiet. The woods are full of sound, squirrels moving in the leaf litter before first light, the barred owls finishing up their night work, a woodpecker somewhere in the dead timber starting early. But the stillness is in the absence of the sounds you're listening for. Hooves in leaves, the particular crunch and pause rhythm of a deer moving through October hardwood litter. I sat that stand each morning and came back to camp each afternoon, and the week moved at the pace that a deer camp week moves, slower than regular time and better for it. I cooked on the 2-burner propane stove and ate out of the cast iron pan I've been carrying in the truck for 15 years. Made coffee twice a day, the camp kind, grounds in the pot, strained through a bandana into the cup. Read in the evenings by headlamp before the fire died down enough that the cold came through the canvas. The shortleaf pine at the west edge of the clearing dropped resin-coated cones into the fire ring when the wind moved the canopy, and they burned with a different smell than the hardwood. Sharper, almost medicinal in quality. The fire would go to coals around 10, and I'd zip the tent and lie in the sleeping bag listening to the creek and the owls until I was out. I run 3 cameras on this hunt. The Stealth Cam G42NG has been on the North Trail for 4 seasons. No glow infrared. The G42 has a better trigger speed than a lot of cameras in its price range, and the no-glow LEDs mean it doesn't throw the red glow that wary bucks pick up on. I strapped it to a white oak about 250 yards north of camp, angled across the main deer trail that comes down the ridge from the upper bench. Lithium batteries, which I run instead of alkaline because lithium holds charge better when the temperature drops through the night. The hollers in the Caney Creek area can drop to 35, 38 degrees by 3 in the morning in October, and alkaline starts dragging. The second camera is a Bushnell core, set up 2 seasons ago on the east side of the clearing at a scrape location near the creek crossing. There's a licking branch over a patch of bare ground at the base of a hickory tree that the bucks work every October, and the core gets good resolution at that range. I've gotten some of my best buck images off that camera. The third camera is what this comes down to. A Moultrie Edge strapped to a shortleaf pine 40 feet from the tent door, facing south across the clearing. I started running a camp camera 3 years ago because of the feral hogs. The hog population in the Caney Creek drainage has grown significantly since 2019. I don't know if it's a pressure shift from elsewhere in the forest or just normal expansion, but the sign around the campsite and the surrounding timber has gone from occasional to consistent, and hogs will come into camp after the fire dies down if they smell food. I keep a tight camp, food hung or locked in the truck, but the camera lets me confirm what's coming in at night. The Moultrie Edge has a cellular option, a monthly subscription plan that transmits images to a phone app. I'd had the plan turned off because the cell coverage on the Forest Service road is inconsistent, and previous seasons had taught me I wasn't going to get reliable transmissions. The camera was running on standard mode, images to the SD card. No transmission. I'd review when I got home. That's the relevant detail. I reviewed when I got home. Wednesday evening, Fort Smith. I started with the North Trail Stealth Cam card. 112 images across 5 nights, 11 bucks, ranging from small 4 points to a solid 8 point I'd passed on Wednesday morning, which I don't regret. The black bear showed up again, a sow I've been tracking for 2 seasons based on size and the pattern of when she uses the trail. Come in Tuesday night to investigate a scrape one of the bucks had been working near the trail camera. Coyote passing through once. 2 armadillos, which always photograph strangely in infrared because the shell reflects the IR differently than fur does, and the camera produces something that looks like it crawled out of a different time entirely. Normal footage. Good, clean, expected trail camera work. The Bushnell card from the creek crossing was 87 images. Normal deer traffic, 2 bucks visiting the scrape, the usual doe activity in the early evening hours. 1 image from Monday night that I noted without much attention at the time. An empty trigger at 12:42 a.m. The camera firing with nothing in the frame. These happen. A branch moves. A temperature shift fools the passive infrared sensor. The camera fires on nothing. I filed it and moved on. Then the Moultrie camp camera card. 423 images. I loaded it and started scrolling. The raccoon with the notched left ear showed up on Sunday night and came back twice during the week. The hog sounder Monday night, 3 adults and what looked like 5 or 6 smaller ones, working the south edge of the clearing for about 40 minutes before moving off. A doe and fawn crossing the north edge of camp on Wednesday evening. A gray fox at the east entry point on Tuesday around midnight, which I always appreciate. Gray foxes are common enough in the Ouachita, but they almost never let themselves be seen in daylight, and trail cameras are usually the only way you get a good look. Normal camp traffic. Sunday night, nothing unusual. Monday night, the hogs, but otherwise normal. Tuesday night, nothing unusual through 2 in the morning. At 2:18 a.m. on Tuesday, the camera fired once. The image showed the clearing in standard no-glow IR, the flat gray-green wash, the fire ring at 30 feet centered in the frame, the folding camp table at the left edge, the front of the tent visible on the right. The reference points I know from 100 images on that card. At the back of the clearing, at the southern tree line, about 60 to 65 feet from the camera, something was standing. I stopped scrolling. The Moultrie's infrared illumination holds well to 50 feet and degrades past that, and at 65 feet the image has the quality of something caught at the edge of your peripheral vision, present, with enough definition to register, without enough to describe precisely. A vertical form, upright, width and height consistent with an adult person, arms at the sides or close enough that the distance and image quality didn't allow me to see more. No movement caught. The camera captures stills, not continuous video, and the only record of this moment was the single frame. My first thought was another hunter. The Ouachita National Forest allows dispersed camping throughout most of its acreage, and in archery season you'll find people scattered across the drainages. My clearing has always felt private, a quarter-mile off the end of the road with no obvious path in from any other direction, but I'd never known with certainty that I was the only person who used it. Maybe somebody else had found the same bench and one night got turned around in the dark and drifted into the edge of my camp. I saved the image in a folder labeled "Check Later" and kept scrolling. I got to Wednesday night and I found the sequence that stopped me for the rest of the evening. Between 1:47 a.m. and 2:08 a.m., 21 minutes, the Moultrie fired 29 times. The first 3 images in the sequence were empty: the clearing, the fire ring, the tent, the usual reference points, no visible subject. The camera was triggering on nothing. Except the camera was triggering on something. That's the thing about passive infrared sensors, and I know this from 40 years of wiring them into commercial and industrial systems. The PIR detects heat differential, the temperature difference between a warm body and the ambient air temperature. On an October night in a Ouachita Hollow, when the air is in the low 40s, any warm-blooded animal generates enough differential to trigger the sensor clearly at the rated detection range. The Moultrie Edge's detection range is about 80 feet on a standard night. 3 consecutive triggers with no visible subject in the frame don't mean nothing was there. They mean something was in the detection zone that the infrared illumination wasn't reaching clearly enough to image, something at the outer edge of the sensor's range, or something at a distance and angle that degraded the image quality below what the lens could resolve. At 1:50 a.m., the 4th image in the sequence, the subject was in frame. It was 30 to 35 feet from the camera, in the open clearing, in the space between the fire ring and the tent entrance. At that range, on a 12-megapixel camera with the IR array firing at full strength, you get enough resolution to evaluate what you're looking at. I've been doing trail camera work for 15 years and I know what the resolution looks like at various distances in various conditions. The subject was upright. Height roughly 5'10", possibly just under. The build was lean in a way that read as reduced to minimum, not underweight, but as if every dimension had been brought down as far as it could go without losing structural function. The covering, whatever it was, ran from the collar area to the wrists and ankles, consistent in color, a flat dark charcoal in the IR that didn't vary. Real clothing varies in infrared. Fabric has wrinkles, seam lines, pressure points where it pulls against a body, and those variations produce subtle differences in how the IR returns. What I was looking at had none of that. The dark covering was uniform from top to bottom, the same reflectance across the entire surface, the same texture. The arms were at the sides, but not relaxed. Slightly away from the body, elbows slightly bent, hands forward of where they'd fall if the arms were fully limp. The hands were open, fingers extended with a slight spread between them. The posture of someone trying to sense something through their palms without making contact. The hands were long. I have large hands, an electrician's hands, wide palms and long reach, and I used my own hand against the screen as a reference. The fingers in the image extended past where mine would have fallen at the same scale. Not dramatically. Enough that when I compared them against the hand proportions of the deer in other images on the same card, the difference held. The head was tilted forward and slightly to one side, facing the tent entrance, not the camera. I went to the next image. 1:50 and 14 seconds, same subject, same position. The camera cycled every 14 seconds through the rest of the sequence, and across 21 minutes of images, the subject did not move. At 2:08 a.m., the frame was empty again. Whatever had been standing between the fire ring and my tent entrance was gone. I went back to the image directly before the sequence. 1:45 a.m. The clearing was empty. Something had walked into my camp at 1:47 in the morning, stood in the open clearing 30 feet from the tent entrance for 21 minutes without making a sound I heard from inside the tent, and left. Then I looked at the shadows in the 1:50 a.m. image. The Moultrie's IR LED array fires from the camera housing, which means the camera is the light source. In any standard IR trail camera image, shadows run directly behind the subject, away from the camera, because the camera is the only illumination. I've looked at thousands of trail camera images, and that shadow geometry is consistent across all of them. In the 1:50 a.m. image, with the subject standing in the open clearing at 35 feet, the shadow ran to the left, not behind the subject. To the left, at an angle that would require a second light source positioned to the right of the frame, elevated about 40 to 45 degrees. There was no second light source. The fire had been cold since 10 p.m. No lamp, no flashlight, no other camera. The timber on the right side of the frame was dark timber. I checked the raccoon images from earlier that same night, the hog images from Monday, every other frame on that card where a subject was in the clearing. Every single shadow ran backward correctly. Camera as source, shadows pointing away. The 1:50 a.m. image was the only frame on the entire card with a shadow running the wrong direction, and the only thing different about that frame was the subject standing in it. I went back through Tuesday night with different eyes. The single image of a vertical shape at the tree line at 2:18. The form I'd originally read as another hunter getting turned around in the dark. I looked at the empty triggers that preceded it on Tuesday night. 3 empty triggers spread across the 2 hours before the 2:18 image. The camera firing on nothing visible in the frame. The same pattern as Wednesday night, before the subject moved into range. The Moultrie Edge uses a dual detection system, passive infrared combined with an optical motion sensor, and the two don't always agree. The PIR component is what initiates most triggers on still nights. It reads temperature differential in the sensor's arc and fires when something with a heat signature crosses the field. The optical component provides a secondary check and is more sensitive to fast movement than to slow movement. On a still October night with no wind, with the temperature holding at 42 degrees in the hollow, the most reliable trigger source is PIR. The empty triggers were not camera malfunction. The empty triggers were the PIR sensor catching something at the limit of its detection range, something whose heat signature was present, but not strong enough at that distance to produce a clear image. On Wednesday night, the same thing had moved close enough for the IR to image it clearly. On Tuesday night, it had stayed at the outer edge. I went back through Monday night. 2 empty triggers between midnight and 2 a.m. I went back through Sunday night. 2 empty triggers between 11 p.m. and 1 a.m. It had been there from the first night, staying at the margin of what the sensor could catch, close enough to trigger the camera but not close enough for the image to resolve on the first 2 nights. Visible at the tree line, 60 feet out on night 3. In the open clearing at 30 feet on night 4. I queued up Thursday night's images. The camera fired once at 2:58 a.m. 1 image. The subject was at the back of the tent, not at the tree line, not in the clearing between the fire ring and the entrance. At the rear corner of the tent, where the side wall meets the back wall, the corner that faced the pine timber at the north edge of the clearing. The Moultrie's mounting angle and position on the pine gave it a sight line along the north side of the tent to the rear, and the subject was there, at the rear corner, approximately 8 to 10 feet from the canvas. The rear wall. The wall my sleeping bag was pushed against. The wall I was sleeping 4 feet from on the other side of the canvas. The IR lit the subject fully at 8 feet. 12 megapixels in full illumination at close range, the clearest image I'd gotten across all 5 nights. The build was the same. The arms at the sides with that slight forward extension of the hands. The dark uniform covering. But the head position was different from the clearing images, not facing the tent entrance. Tilted down and angled slightly back, toward the camera, putting the face in 3/4 profile. In a human face seen in 3/4 profile at 8 to 10 feet in full IR illumination, you get enough detail to evaluate the structure. The nose projects forward from the plane of the face. The brow creates a distinct line. The jaw defines the lower silhouette. Bone and cartilage under skin produce a face that is visibly 3-dimensional, and IR renders that depth clearly at close range. This face didn't have that depth. The profile was too flat. Not damaged, not deformed, not in shadow, fully lit, clean image, 8 feet from the sensor. The features were present. I could make out the nose position, the jawline, the placement of the eye socket, but the relief behind them wasn't there. The face looked the way a face looks when it's been drawn on a surface rather than built up from bone, present as impression, but not as volume. I closed the laptop at 12:40 a.m. I sat in the kitchen and I thought about 5 nights in the tent. The head angle in the clearing images was chin down, tilted toward the tent entrance, in the posture of looking at something lower than eye level. At 30 feet, with the tent entrance at ground level, that angle would put the sight line at the tent's lower door panel. The head angle in the Thursday image, at the rear corner of the tent, 8 feet from the back wall, was tilted down and forward, in the posture of looking at something at approximately waist height on the outside surface of the canvas. There was nothing at waist height on the outside surface of the canvas. The rear of a wall tent at waist height is just canvas over the aluminum frame and the air inside. Except inside, on the other side of that canvas, at waist height, 4 feet from the back wall, was a sleeping bag. With me in it. The understanding of what that head angle meant arrived the way nausea arrives, not as a thought, not as a conclusion I reasoned to, but as a certainty that settled into my chest and sat there. It wasn't looking at the tent. It was looking through the tent at me. I got up and checked the lock on the back door, which I hadn't locked in 6 years. I locked it. I went through the house and locked every other door and every window I could reach, and I left every light on, the way I'd left them on in the bad months after Lorraine died, when the house felt too large and too empty, and the dark in the rooms she'd used felt like it was expanding to fill the space she'd left. That was October. I've been working through what those 5 nights mean ever since. I called Mark Davis the next morning. He picked up before the second ring, which meant he was already moving. And I said I needed him to look at something, and then I texted him the Thursday image without any explanation of what he was looking at or where the camera was positioned. He called back 11 minutes later. "There's someone standing behind a tent," he said. "Camp camera image," I said. "Camera is 40 feet north of the tent, facing south. The tent in the right edge of the frame was my tent." A pause. "You were in the tent." "Asleep. It was 3 in the morning." "This is 8 feet from your tent." 8 to 10, yeah." "And you didn't hear anything?" "Nothing. 5 nights? Nothing." I could hear him processing. Mark ran the floor of a John Deere dealership for 20 years, which is work that demands a very particular kind of mind, everything in terms of what the machine is doing and how to diagnose what it isn't doing. He doesn't jump to conclusions. He sits with something before he calls it. I heard him sitting with this one. "The arms," he said. "Long, yeah. The hands are past the hip line. Relative to the body height, longer than they should be. And the face." He was quiet for a moment. "The profile is wrong. No depth in it." "That's not a profile I've seen on a person." "No." He exhaled slowly. Then he said, "How many nights of images?" 5, but it was there all 5 nights. Farther out on nights 1 and 2, just inside detection range. Tree line at night 3, open clearing at night 4, this at night 5. Getting closer every night. Every night. The silence from his end went long enough that I checked if the call was still connected. Then he said, "Tom, you've been running this campsite for 22 years. "Yeah." "Before you had the camp camera?" "Before 2019, yeah." "So you don't know what was coming into that clearing before 2019. That was the part I'd been sitting with since midnight. 22 years of sleeping in that clearing. 19 of them without a camera pointed at the camp. 19 of them with no record of what came in after the fire went down. And I was zipped into the sleeping bag. "No," I said. "I don't know." "What do you want to do?" he said. "I want to go back through the North Trail camera. I think I missed something." I had. On the Stealth Cam G42NG card from the North Trail. Wednesday night. The same night the subject was standing in the clearing for 21 minutes. At 1:31 a.m., 16 minutes before the first images showed the subject between the fire ring and the tent, the camera triggered. The image showed the North Trail empty. But at the left edge of the frame, where the trail curves south and downhill toward camp, there was motion. A vertical smear at the left margin, the right height, moving south. Something tall, crossing the edge of the frame headed toward camp, moving too fast to be captured fully, but leaving enough of a mark to confirm it had been there and confirm the direction. south, toward camp. 16 minutes before it was standing 30 feet from my tent entrance. I went through the rest of the north camera's images from Wednesday night forward. At 4:47 a.m., 2 hours and 39 minutes after the last camp camera image showed the clearing empty, the stealth cam triggered again. Motion at the right edge of the frame. Something moving north, back up the trail, back toward the ridge. It had come down from the ridge, spent time in my camp, and gone back up the way it had come. A route, a direction of travel with a clear purpose to it. The Caney Creek Wilderness is a federally designated wilderness area, which means no motorized vehicles inside the boundary and limited permanent infrastructure. The trails that exist are mostly old logging roads from the 19-teens that have been reverting to timber for 100 years. And the bench where my campsite sits is far enough off the end of the Forest Service road that most hunters don't find it unless they've been working that drainage long enough to know what the terrain looks like from a topo map. I know the drainage well enough that I could walk it in the dark, which I've done more than once in 22 years. The hollows between the ridges hold cold air and the creek drainage channels it, so the temperature in the bottom can be 10 degrees colder than the ridge top on a still night. The shortleaf pine on the ridge holds heat differently than the hardwoods in the hollow, and you can feel the temperature shift moving between them. I drove back to the campsite the following Wednesday. Not to camp, I wasn't sleeping out there, not then, just to walk the ground and fix it in real space, rather than in pixels. Images on a laptop are one kind of knowledge, and it's the kind that starts to loosen after a few days if you let it, where your rational mind begins to suggest you were reading too much into noise and distance. Standing in a place is different. I hiked in from the turnaround and stood at the fire ring and walked the measurements. 62 feet to the south tree line, 29 feet from the camera to where the subject had stood in the clearing on Wednesday night. I walked to the rear of where the tent had been and stood at the back corner and looked north at the space where the sleeping bag had been. And I stood there for a while with the November light coming through the short-leaf pine canopy and the creek quiet in the hollow below. 8 feet. I crouched and looked at the leaf litter at the rear corner. 6 weeks of weather had settled things in, blown leaves over everything, and whatever might have been pressed into the ground was covered and gone. There was nothing I could read as evidence, and nothing that told me evidence hadn't once been there. I noticed the fire ring before I left. 3 of the sandstone pieces had shifted since I'd last been at the site. 2 of them knocked outward from the ring. 1 displaced about 18 inches from its original position, sitting alone in the leaf litter. I rebuilt the ring, resetting the stones, and hiked out. On the drive back through the forest on Highway 270, I made a decision. When I got home, I was going to pull the camp camera's SD card, put in a fresh one, and activate the cellular subscription on the Moultrie Edge app. I wasn't going to be at the campsite to pull the card, but if something came into that clearing, I wanted to know about it when it happened. I activated the plan that evening. The app pulled its first images within the hour: the clearing in the November late afternoon light, the rebuilt fire ring, the bare bench above the creek. Empty and quiet. The first notification came through November 14th, 2:04 a.m. The subject was at the south tree line, the exact position it had been in on Tuesday night of the hunt, when I'd been sleeping 50 feet away. I looked at that image at 2:12 in the morning from my bed in Fort Smith. Same height, same dark covering, same arms at the sides. Standing at the tree line of an empty campsite, 4 weeks after the last time I'd been there. Whatever it wasn't following me. It was going back to the site. 3 more notifications came in through the end of November and into December. November 30th, 2:22 a.m., south tree line again. December 10th, 2:18 a.m., back corner of the clearing. The position of the tent's rear corner. Standing in an empty clearing where the tent no longer stood, at the exact location where the canvas rear wall had been. Then, on December 11th, the app sent me a secondary notification at 6:14 a.m. The camera had detected motion but flagged a low-quality image. I pulled it up. The fire ring. The sandstone ring I'd rebuilt on my visit 2 weeks earlier. 3 of the stones had been moved. The same 3 pieces that had been displaced on my November visit, pulled back out of the ring and placed in a line on the ground north of the ring, parallel to each other, even spacing, about 8 inches between them. I went through the images between 2:18 a.m., when the subject had been at the rear corner of the clearing, and 6:14 a.m. when the camera flagged the ring disturbance. 14 images across that span. Empty clearing in all of them except the 2:18 a.m. capture. Something had moved 3 specific stones out of a fire ring and arranged them in an even line between 2:18 and 6:14 a.m. The only subject captured in any image during that window was the subject at 2:18. I drove out the following week and looked at the stones myself. 3 flat pieces of sandstone pulled from the ring, laid parallel on the north side with even spacing between them. I rebuilt the ring a second time, set all 3 back in their places, walked the clearing once, and hiked out. 2 nights later, another notification. The ring was intact. Nobody had touched it again. Whatever the arrangement meant, I've thought about it for a year and I don't have an answer. It happened once and wasn't repeated. I spent January doing research I'd been putting off because part of me wasn't sure what I wanted to find. The Arkansas State Library's digital collection has been scanning and indexing Polk County historical records since around 2015, with the scope and completeness varying by subject and era. I went through the land survey records and plat maps from the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The drainage where my campsite sits was surveyed federal land. No recorded homesteads, no private deeds, no mineral claims in that immediate area. A timber company logged it in the 19-teens, which the second growth timber I'd been hunting all these years already told me. Before that, the land surveys from the 1890s show undisturbed federal territory. I found a reference to a civilian Conservation Corps camp assigned to the Caney Creek area in 1933. The CCC built most of the original fire roads in this district, and the camp was listed as working the drainage through 1936. The CCC built the fire ring at my campsite. That's my best guess. The sandstone stacking technique matches what I've seen at other 30s-era CCC structures in the Ouachita. And the style of the ring? Flat pieces set on edge in a tight circle rather than the loose, informal rings most hunters build. Has that institutional quality of someone doing it the right way because they'd been trained to do it right. The ring that has been at the center of my campsite for 22 years was built around 90 years ago by men on a government work program, which means it was there for 60 years before I ever found it. I called the Ouachita National Forest District office in Mena in late January. The ranger I reached was named Paul Scott. He'd been working the district since 2003 and he knew the Caney Creek drainage by name, which not everyone does. It's not one of the main recreation corridors, and it doesn't show up in the visitor materials. I told him I was doing historical research on a campsite I'd been using in the drainage, and wanted to know about the site's documented history. He was cooperative, the way rangers are cooperative when someone's asking about forest history rather than complaining about trail conditions. We talked through the logging history, the CCC period, the fire road decommissions in the 80s, standard Ouachita land management history. Then I told him I'd found something in the State Library's digital archive that had caught my attention. A Forest Service incident report from 1978, filed through the Mena office, describing a group of hunters who'd reported unusual activity at a campsite in the Caney Creek drainage. Equipment moved overnight. A motion-detecting camp alarm triggering without visible cause. And, in the language of the report itself, the repeated observation of an upright figure at the edge of the campsite in the hours between midnight and 3 a.m. The responding rangers had found nothing and attributed the reports to bear activity. Paul Scott was quiet for a moment. "Where did you find that report?" he asked. I told him. The State Library's historical records collection, accessible through their digital archive, misfiled under a different year in the catalog. "We have a copy in the district files," he said. "It came up a few years ago when another group filed a similar complaint from that same area." "What kind of complaint?" "Upright figure at the camp perimeter," he said. "Motion disturbances. They'd set up a laser tripwire alarm, the kind hunters use to detect deer entering a bait site, and it was triggering every couple nights without them seeing what set it off. And on the last night of their trip, One of them woke up and looked out the tent screen and saw something at the tree line. What did it look like? Upright, he said. That's the word he used both times I talked to him. Just upright. He said it was person height and person shaped, but something about the proportions was off, and he couldn't specify what. They packed out the next morning. He paused. I went out there myself and found nothing definitive. No track castings that matched any identified species in a consistent pattern. No physical damage. Nothing I could write up and submit as evidence of anything in particular. But, I said, I've been in this district since 2003, and that area of the drainage, the benches above the creek between the first and second ridge, has a higher concentration of these kinds of reports than anywhere else in my territory, going back as far as the records go. He paused again. People seeing something at the edge of camp at night, equipment disturbed, motion detectors triggering on nothing visible, and in the descriptions, always the same few words, upright, quiet, and wrong, in some way they can't name. Not wrong like it scared them immediately. Wrong like it took them a while to realize something wasn't right, and then they couldn't stop thinking about it. Do you have a working theory? I asked. I have an observation, he said. The Ouachita covers a lot of country that hasn't been significantly disturbed by human activity for decades. There are parts of this forest that see a handful of people a year, and that's it. And I think there are things moving through those parts of the forest that we don't have in our formal wildlife inventory. That's the most I'll say in any official capacity, because I don't have evidence sufficient to support anything more specific. He said one more thing before we got into the practical logistics. I asked him about the 1978 hunters specifically, the ones in the original report, the elk hunters who had seen the shape at the camp perimeter multiple nights running. He said he didn't know who they were. The report listed initials only, which was sometimes the practice in that era, and the contact information on file was a phone number that hadn't been in service for decades. He'd tried to locate them when the Texarkana hunters filed their complaint, thinking it might be useful to have a first-hand account from the original report, and hadn't been able to. They were out there somewhere, or they were gone by now. They would have been in their 40s in 1978, which put them in their late 80s or older if they were still living. Whatever they saw on those nights in the Caney Creek drainage in the fall of that year, they had taken it with them when they left. That is the thing about a place with a history that doesn't get written down in any complete or systematic way. The people who experienced it age and move on, and what they knew goes with them, and the next person who finds the place starts from zero without knowing anyone was there before them. I started from zero in 2001. I found the bench, the level ground, the old fire ring, and I assumed they were there because the terrain was good and someone before me had recognized it the way I did. I didn't look for any other explanation because I didn't have a reason to. 22 years later, I had 3 SD cards worth of reasons. We talked a few more minutes about the practical matters, reporting procedures if I saw something that needed documentation, how to submit camera images through the district office if I wanted them in a file. I thanked him and we ended the call. I sat with that conversation for the rest of the afternoon. 1978 was the earliest formal documentation he knew of, but he'd said the reports went back as far as the records go, which meant there were likely reports before that year he hadn't found. 45 years of documented pattern in one drainage, and whatever I had on those SD cards was part of the same pattern. I drove out to the campsite one more time in February, on a cold, bright day when the hollows were down to bare timber and the ridgelines were visible from a distance the way they aren't in summer. I rebuilt the fire ring for the 3rd time. The 3 sandstone pieces had been moved again since my January visit, set back in the same parallel line north of the ring. Even spacing. Same as before. I reset them, walked the clearing, stood at the rear corner of the tent site for a few minutes. The creek was up in February, running loud enough to hear clearly from the bench, and the barred owl was somewhere in the canopy doing the middle-of-the-day calls that have nothing to do with hunting and everything to do with whatever owls communicate about when they're not working. The pine timber on the north side of the clearing was dark, even in the February sun, the light not reaching into the understory past a certain depth. I didn't see anything. Nothing moved in the timber that I could call wrong. The bench was a bench. The creek ran in the hollow. The winter light came through the bare canopy and landed on the leaf litter the way winter light does. I drove home through the forest on Highway 270 and thought about what it means to have a place you've used for 22 years and then find out what else has been using it. I booked a different campsite for the following season. Still Polk County, still the Caney Creek drainage, but on the east-facing ridge rather than the bench I'd been camping for 2 decades. Different terrain, different approach from the Forest Service Road, different camera positions. I did 3 nights of archery season there in October, and then 4 nights during rifle season in November. The cameras took good deer images. A black bear that worked the area 3 nights running, 2 coyotes on the creek trail. Nothing I couldn't name. I slept without disturbance. I left the Moultrie running on the pine at the old site. The cellular plan renews automatically. Every 2 weeks or so, I scroll through what the app has retained. Wildlife traffic is what fills most of the images. Deer, the bear that has been using the bench consistently for 2 seasons now. Raccoons, a bobcat once in early spring that I watched pick its way through the clearing edge on the small screen of my phone while sitting in a parking lot in Fort Smith. Good wildlife footage. Good documentation of what the bench looks like when it's just a bench. And then every few weeks, at 2 in the morning or close to it, an image that isn't wildlife. The subject at the south tree line. The subject at the rear corner of the clearing. Once, in February of 2023, standing inside the fire ring itself, head bowed, looking at the sandstone. I've been watching these images come in for over a year, and I've started to notice variations in the posture that I didn't track at first. The head angle changes night to night. Some nights it's in that chin-down posture, facing the ground at the back corner of the clearing where the tent's rear wall met the earth. Some nights it's tilted sideways, not toward the camera, not toward the tree line, just sideways, in the posture of someone listening for something at a frequency just beyond what you'd expect to hear. Once the head was tilted up, looking at the canopy or the sky above the clearing, which I've turned over in my mind many times and arrived at nothing useful. The position is consistent even when the head angle changes. It comes back to the south tree line or the rear corner of the clearing, the space where the tent's back wall stood. It doesn't range widely through the clearing. It comes to specific locations, and it stays. Mark Davis came up to Fort Smith in January of 2023, his first visit since the knee replacement, driving over from Texarkana for the weekend. We sat at the kitchen table and went through the full run of images together, the original 5 nights from October, and then all the cellular images that had come in through the fall and early winter. He took his time. He went back and forth between the older images and the newer ones, comparing positions and head angles, the way he analyzes anything he's trying to understand, methodically. When he got to the end of the stack, he closed the laptop and looked at the Arkansas River through the kitchen window, which is visible on clear days, gray-green and low in January. "The stones," he said. "Yeah, that's not random. The spacing is too even, and it's always the same 3 stones." "Why the same 3? "I don't know." He sat with it, picked up his coffee, set it back down. "I keep thinking about the head angle in the tent images," he said. "The way it's looking down at waist height on the outside of the canvas. What's on the outside of a tent wall at waist height? Nothing, but on the inside. The sleeping bag, me in it." He nodded. We sat without talking for a while. The river out the window and the January light going gray in the afternoon the way it does in Arkansas. The cold working through the old windows. "Why do you think it keeps going back?" he said. "You're not there anymore. You haven't camped there since October." "I've thought about that more than anything else," I said. "The CCC built that fire ring in the 30s. The drainage has had hunters and campers using it going back farther than any specific record I've found. Whatever draws it to that clearing, whether it's the site itself, something about the physical location on that bench above the creek, or something about the accumulation of human presence there over decades. My leaving hasn't changed it. Whatever I was to it when I was sleeping in that tent was one piece of whatever the place has always been to it." "Does that make it better or worse?" he said. I didn't answer, because the honest answer was that I couldn't tell. Before Mark left that Sunday, we sat with the laptop open to the November 14th image one more time. The first cellular notification. The first evidence the subject had returned to the empty campsite after I broke camp and drove home. He looked at it without speaking for a while. Then he said that the thing that got him was what it did when the tent wasn't there anymore. I asked him what he meant by that. He said that when the tent was present, the subject had moved toward it, getting closer every night. That was one behavior, approach and proximity and investigation of what was there. But the cellular images were different. The tent was gone, the camp was empty, and the subject was still going back to the exact position where the tent's rear corner had stood. That wasn't investigation of something present. That was something else. I said the word memory. He looked at me and said he had been going to say habit. But yes, whatever word you put on it, the implication is the same. Returning to a specific location within a specific clearing after the object or person that was there has been gone for weeks is not animal foraging behavior. Not territorial marking, not any behavioral category I know how to apply to what the camera has been capturing. It is the behavior of something that holds a specific location in its understanding of where it is and returns to it because of what happened there. What happened there was me. 5 nights of sleeping 4 feet from the back wall of a canvas tent that the subject stood 8 feet from on the final night. I don't know what that represents to whatever keeps going back to the clearing. I have spent enough time thinking about it that thinking about it further has stopped adding anything new. I went back to the campsite twice in the spring of 2023 to do camera maintenance and walk the ground. Both times in daylight, both times on weekday mornings when the Forest Service road was empty. The clearing was quiet both visits. Nothing moved in the timber that I could identify as out of place. The fire ring had been disturbed once between the visits. 2 of the stones moved, but not arranged in the parallel line this time, just displaced, sitting at an odd angle, and I reset them and left. Both nights after my visits, the app sent notifications. The subject at the south tree line, as if the daytime visits and the nighttime returns were on separate schedules that didn't interact with each other. In September, I drove out one more time before the fall season started. Standard preseason maintenance, replace the Moultrie's batteries, pull the cellular SD and put in a fresh one, check the camera angle, which had drifted slightly because a branch had grown into the upper left corner of the frame over the summer. I adjusted the mounting strap, verified the angle against the clearing, hiked out. That night, 2:11 a.m., notification. The clearing after a rain. The leaves just starting to turn color at the hardwood edges. The south tree line. The subject standing there in the wet dark. The same height, the same covering, the same arms at the sides with that barely open extension of the hands. I looked at the image in my bedroom for a few minutes. Then I put the phone down and went to sleep. Mark is coming back to the Ouachita this fall for the first time since his surgery. I've booked the east-facing ridge site again, a half-mile from the bench. We'll run the same 3 cameras I've been using at the ridge site, plus he'll bring his own Browning for the North Trail. 2 people at the ridge site, a half-mile of terrain between us and the old clearing, and the Moultrie cellular still running on the pine. He knows about the images. He's the only person I've shown them to, and he's seen all of them, the original 5-night sequence and the year-plus of cellular captures since. When we were going over the logistics for the upcoming season a few weeks ago, at the end of the call he said that I was going to be checking the old campsite app the whole time we were out there. I said yes. He said, and if it shows up at the ridge site instead. I told him I didn't have an answer to that. We talked through the access road conditions and what the deer sign was looking like going into the season, and then we signed off. But he was right to ask. I've been sitting with that question since he raised it. Going to be checking the old campsite app the whole time we're out there. Yes, I said. And if it shows up at the ridge site instead. I didn't have an answer to that. He didn't push. We talked through the access road conditions and what the deer reports were looking like for the coming season, and then we signed off. The notification came in last Tuesday. 2:17 a.m., the clearing, the south tree line, the subject standing in the position it's been taking for a year and a half. I looked at the image for a few minutes in the dark of my bedroom. The phone, the only light. Same height, same covering, same long hands with the spread fingers resting at the sides, the head at the sideways tilt, the listening posture. I don't know what it's listening for. I've been trying to figure that out since the first time I noticed the tilt in November of 2022. I put the phone down. Saturday morning, I'll scroll through the week's images the way I do every week now. Deer, the bear, the raccoon, if it's still using the bench. Whatever else moves through the clearing in the night. And then the Tuesday image, which I know is in there waiting. I'll look at it, note the position and the distance and the head angle, add it to the folder. Then I'll close the app and go make coffee. What I know after a year and a half of these images. The subject is roughly human height. The proportions are close to human and wrong in specific ways. Arms too long relative to the body. Hands with fingers past where they should end. A face that doesn't have the depth that bones and cartilage produce. The heat signature is consistent with a warm-blooded organism but lower than expected at the detection distances involved, as if the core temperature is cooler than 98 degrees. The passive infrared sensor catches it clearly once it's inside 35 feet. Catches it intermittently at greater distances, and apparently missed it entirely on nights 1 and 2 of my hunt when it was staying at the outer margin of the detection range. The earliest documented report of something consistent with this description in this drainage dates to 1978. The district ranger I spoke with in Mena said the pattern went back as far as the records go, and the records don't go as far back as the CCC fire ring. The subject returns to the clearing on no fixed schedule. Some weeks there are 2 or 3 images, some weeks there are none for 3 or 4 weeks, and then 2 nights in a row. It returns to specific positions within the clearing, the south tree line, the rear corner, occasionally the interior near the fire ring. It doesn't range randomly through the camp. It goes to places that had significance when the tent was there. The tent has been gone for a year. The significance apparently persists. I don't know what it is. I've looked at a year and a half of images at every zoom level I can manage on the laptop, in every lighting condition the Moultrie produces, at every range from 8 feet to 60 plus, and I don't have a category for it. I know the body of local wildlife well enough after 38 seasons in the Ouachita to tell you what it isn't, and that list is longer and more useful than it sounds. I keep paying the monthly plan. The camera is still on the pine tree. The clearing is still there above the Caney Creek hollow. The old CCC sandstone fire ring still at the center of it, rebuilt 3 times now by my hands and displaced at least as many times by something else's. Whatever found that bench, whether it found it before the CCC built the ring in 1933, or whether the ring and the decades of fire and human activity drew it in, is still going back to it, at 2 in the morning. Standing in the place where the tent stood for 22 years, and where I slept all those nights without a camera to show me what I was sleeping near. I don't know if it knew I was there from the first night, or if it found me gradually. I don't know if the 5 nights in October were the first time it had come that close, or if it had been doing it for years before I had a camera aimed at the camp. I don't know what the stones mean. I don't know what it's looking for when it stands at the rear corner of the clearing and tilts its head toward the ground where the tent's back wall used to meet the earth. What I know is that for 5 nights in the middle of October 2022, I slept in a canvas tent in the Ouachita National Forest, and something spent those 5 nights walking closer to me each night, and by the last night it was 8 feet from the wall I was sleeping against. I didn't hear it once. I'm going back to the Ouachita this fall. Different site, same forest. Mark will be there. First time in 2 years, and we'll run the cameras and hunt the ridge and eat bad camp food and sit at the fire the way we've been doing for going on 25 years. The Moultrie will be on the pine. The app will be on my phone. When the notifications come in at 2 in the morning, I'll look at them. I keep thinking eventually I'll understand what I'm looking at. I keep thinking that. The Ouachita has been the one constant in 40 years of an adult life that changed in most of the other ways adult lives change. Career. Marriage, kids, the house in Fort Smith that went from full to empty and quiet again. The forest stayed the same. The ridges running east to west stayed the same. The shortleaf pine on the rocky upland and the red oak in the hollows and the creek running 100 different ways, depending on what the season had given it. All of that stayed the same. I drove south on I-49 every October, and the forest took me back the way it always had. No account made for what had changed in the intervening year. I don't know what the bench above the creek takes me for. I've been going there for 22 years and sleeping in a canvas tent and burning wood in a 90-year-old fire ring, and I don't know what that looks like from the other side of whatever is going back there. I don't know if my presence there for 2 decades meant something to it, or if it noticed at all until the year it started coming close enough for the camera to catch it. I don't know if the camera itself changed anything, if the no-glow IR firing through those October nights registered to it in some way, if the sensor detecting it in turn gave it information about me. I know the camera is still there. I know the cellular plan is still active. I know the Moultrie Edge is going to fire its IR array at 2 in the morning on a night I'm 100 miles away and produce an image of something I can't name standing in the place where I used to sleep. I'll be checking the app when it does.